I know we're entering in fall, but anyone do track this year at school? Track? Who did track this year? Who has done track before? Raise your hand. Okay, raise them up proud. Who does long distance? Okay. I don't trust these people. Yeah, because you know why? Long distance is like suffering. Like I hate running. So when I did track, I did sprints because I wanted to run as little as possible. That's why I did sprints. I did jumps because you just had to sprint and then jump, and then you're done with it. And let's be honest. Here's why most of us signed up for track, right? It's not because you wanted to like win competitions. Let's be real honest. You did track because you wanted to hang out. Yeah. It's the one sport, right? Well, I don't know if it still is the case, but when I did track, it was the one sport where they didn't divide like boys and girls. Right? Everyone was on the same team. So if you wanted to hang out with your friends and chase after girls, like everybody did track. You guys are looking at me like I'm the only one, right? That's why everybody does track, by the way. And then some of you find your talents and end up growing, which is awesome. I hate the long distance, but at the same time, I admire those who can do it because as much as it's a physical game, I think the longer you run, it's a mental battle. It's a psychological battle that you have to constantly battle over and over through each and every stride. The longest distance in track when I was in it was the mile. Is it still the case? No? What's the longest distance in track these days? 3 miles? 1,500? Oh, they changed it to the 1,500. Well, when I did it, it was a mile, 1,600 meters. The current world record for the mile is 3 minutes, 43 seconds, 0.13. For the longest time, athletes struggled to run the mile under 4 minutes. And it was in 1954, Roger Bannister, he was the first person to run it under 4 minutes. 3 minutes, 49 seconds, and 4/10 of a second. Not even a whole second, just part of a second. But athletes have been pursuing this goal since the 1880s. So for over 60 years, world-class runners all around the globe, they were trying to break this record of running the mile under 4 minutes. But when Roger Bannister did it in 1954, just 46 days later, an Australian runner also did it. He did it in 3 minutes and 58 seconds. And a year later that, 3 runners broke that record in a single race. And over the past 50 years, more than 1,000 runners have broken the record of running the mile under 4 minutes. Here's a point that I want to make. It's really hard to be the first one to do something. It's really hard to accomplish something that's never been done before. But once that barrier, that record is broken, once a person shows that it can be done, it's amazing how people can see that and use it as a model and say, well, he did it, she did it, I can do it, and they can work towards that goal. And once a person breaks that barrier, so many others can break it as well. We're starting today's message from the famous story of David and Goliath. I'm sure many of you have heard it growing up, whether in church or outside of church. Israel was at war with the Philistines. And in this scene, there's a hill on each side and valley in the middle. On one hill, it was the Israelites. The other hill, it was the Philistines. And in the middle was a valley. And Goliath, the champion of the Philistines, came out taunting Israel for 40 days. And he was asking for a battle of champions, right? Why waste the lives of all these men? Let's just battle it out, right? The top 2 guys, the best of your guy against Goliath. If Goliath won, Israel would become slaves to the Philistines. If a champion of Israel can win, then the Philistines would serve Israel. there's just one problem. There was no champion in Israel to fight Goliath because they were all petrified. The Bible says they were shaking, and even some were running just at the sound of Goliath. And David isn't even around the battlefield. His 3 oldest brothers were in the army, and it was David's dad, Jesse, who said, you know what, why don't you bring some food to your brothers and bring back some news and see, give me the news of how they're doing. We don't know how old David was, but we know according to Old Testament law, you had to be at least 20 to fight in the army. And David was the youngest, and he had more than 3 brothers. So we estimate that David had to be around his mid to late teens around this time. He goes to the battlefield. He sees what's happening, Goliath taunting Israel, and everyone petrified. And he finally is before King Saul, and this is what he says in verse 32. Don't worry about this Philistine, David told Saul. I'll go fight him. Next verse, don't be ridiculous, Saul replied. There's no way you can fight this Philistine and possibly win. You're only a boy, and he's been a man of war since his youth. And you have to understand the context, because everyone looks at Saul and goes, man, what a doubter. But look at the context. Goliath was not only a giant who's big and tall. The Bible says his coat of armor weighed 125 pounds. Anyone that can just walk around normally with an extra 125 pounds on your shoulders? And that wasn't the only thing that he had. He had a shield. He had other weapons to carry. Think about the strength that would require him to carry that amount of weight and fight in battle. Actually, before David even goes before Saul, when David is inquiring about Goliath, his oldest brother sees him and gets really upset. What are you doing around here? He says to David. Don't you have some sheep to attend to? You're just here to watch the battle. I know your evil heart. And when David faced Goliath, Goliath couldn't believe it either. Goliath says, who are you that you come at me with a shepherd's stick? And he cursed David. You know, in many ways, the doubts and the criticisms that David got, they're valid. David's brother is right. David had no business being in the front lines. He was a shepherd boy. He was not in the army. He was a teenager. He was just running an errand for his dad. Saul's doubt was valid. What military commander, what commander-in-chief would say to a young boy, a teenage boy who's not a soldier, and say, all right, you go fight that combat veteran who's very scary, who's big, and who has a lot of experience? No commander in his right mind would say that's okay. And of course, Goliath should be offended. He's been warring since his youth. He's won many battles. He's a giant. And they bring this shepherd boy to fight him. But David, for whatever reason that day, just couldn't go back. Despite what his brother said, despite what Saul said, even though he couldn't even wear standard armor, even though Goliath was this massive giant terrifying the Israelites, he just couldn't help but ask, who is this guy? What's the reward for beating him? And he just had to go to Saul and say, don't worry, king, I'll go fight him. And he went before Goliath. Listen, sometimes you can discover your mission for God, not by what you desire, but by what you can't stand. I'll say that again. Sometimes you discover God's call for you, his mission for you, not by what you desire, but by what you are upset about. What hurts you the most, what keeps you awake at night, what offends you the most. Acts 13:22, but God removed Saul and replaced him with David, a man whom God said, I have found David, son of Jesse, a man after my own heart. He will do everything I want him to do. If you have a heart after God's own heart, you will desire what God desires. You will love what he loves, and you will hate what he hates. When everyone is just paralyzed in fear, unable to fight, for some reason, you'll just not be able to stand it. When everyone is just ignoring the issue, you just can't stand it. You just have to address it. You just can't seem to let it go. When that happens, it might be God showing you, this is your call. This is your battle that I'm making you fight, nobody else. This is going to be your giant. David didn't plan on fighting Goliath that day. He was just being obedient to his dad. Didn't know there was going to be Goliath taunting Israel. But once he saw Goliath mocking God's army, mocking God, he felt compelled to do something. And he had to act. Imagine if David said, all right, I'm going to fight this guy, but I'm not ready. So 2 years of training, I'll be back, you guys. It doesn't work that way. They had to fight that day. Goliath was taunting Israel. He was trying to enslave the Israelites. Here's the thing, giants in your life, they will not show up when it's convenient. Giants in your life will not show up when it's convenient. Not when you have a lot of time. Not when you're well rested. No, they show up in the most inconvenient time. Ecclesiastes 11:4. Farmers who wait for perfect weather never plant. If they watch every cloud, they never harvest. But if you're waiting for the perfect time to fight your giant, it won't work. You need faith because life comes with difficulties. Life comes with storms. You need faith because, you know what? Giants will show up when you least expect it to, when circumstances are not great. And you pray, and you pray, and you pray, and you say, Lord, this is not what I prayed for. I didn't pray for giants. Why am I going through this? Yeah, it's not what you prayed for, but it's actually what you might need. It's actually what you might need to get to the promised land in order to grow and mature, in order to be able to fight other giants in your life. Sometimes we're faced with challenges. And some of you are dealing with giants and you're having a rough go. And some of you, your life is great and you're excited about the future and you're hoping to fight giants now. You're like, you know what, God, throw me some giants. I'm ready. I want that glory. I want some heroic success. Be careful what you wish for. Because giants, they're not what you think they're going to be. And they won't show up when you think they will show up. And before you're eager to go out and battle and fight your giants, ask yourself, are you being faithful with the small things today? Because some of you are not willing to fight small battles today, yet you're hoping to slay giants one day. Before David ever faced Goliath, he was fighting wild animals, bears, and lions. He didn't have a crowd to cheer him on. No one gave him credit for doing his job of protecting his sheep. He was just taking care of his responsibilities. And you know what? He was faithful to the little things. His dad sent him on an errand. First of all, if my brother is off at war, and my dad's like, yeah, go to the front line, give him some food. I don't like this at all, right? I'm going to argue with my dad. Sorry, Mike, but Pops, have we thought about this? Like, you want me, a teenage boy, to go to a war zone? Like, I got no weapons, like no training, but you want me to go? I'm pretty sure the army's going to supply him, right? David doesn't give excuses. He still went. And you know what? He wasn't arrogant because he had experience fighting bears and lions. He didn't go, Dad, do you know who I am? I can slay bears and lions. You should send a servant, not me. Some of you think you're too good to serve. You think some things are just beneath you. And you think you ought to be in charge of greater things, better things, but you're not willing to do small things now. Instead, what you ought to do is do what you can right now and do the things that God is showing you now. So when the giants really show up, that you can fight. So many of us don't like the instructions when we get God's call. You say, God, I want to do great things in my life. What God will often do is first give you small tasks, little battles, errands to run, some that you don't want to do, some that make you uncomfortable. Why? Because often it's the small battles that'll make you ready for the big ones. And it's the annoying errands that might get you to places where you need to go, get you connected with people that you need to meet. And by the way, if you think you're too good to do small things, what makes you think you will actually stand your ground when the giants come? If you're dodging small responsibilities now, what makes you think you'll take on the big ones without hesitation when the time comes? Some of you are saying, God, I want to build your church. Maybe God's saying, why don't you actually show up to church? Show up to church and clean up after yourself. You don't even clean up after your mess, and you want to do great things for the body of Christ? Maybe some of you are thinking, I want to preach one day. How about you actually read your Bible first? Show up to small groups, be engaged. Some of you might think, I want to sing up on the stage. But God might actually say, I actually need you to go to the back and do PowerPoint and be in places where no one notices, because I need to know that the stage is not the reason that you're serving me. We don't like a lot of the instructions God gives, his tasks, his errands. But if David did not obey his dad and go on the errand to the front lines, he would have never, ever met Goliath. Sometimes you need to do things that you were not expecting, things that make you uncomfortable. God doesn't want to do everything for you because you're not a baby anymore. And if he did everything for you, you would never, ever change. You would never, ever grow. We need to obey despite uncomfort, despite getting things that you were not expecting, because you rarely will get to choose your giants when they come. Think about your life. Some of the biggest challenges in your life, some of the biggest heartaches, the biggest pain that you experience, you didn't choose them. They showed up, sometimes out of nowhere. Family drama that you didn't choose. Accidents and sickness that you didn't get a say in. You didn't go up to God and say, God, I could really use a storm right now. God, I could really use a giant to fight. No, they just showed up. We don't get to choose what our storms are, what our giants are, but we do have a choice to stay and fight or to cower. Before the days of David and days of kings in Israel, Israelites were enslaved in Egypt. And when they escaped out of slavery, they were to go to the promised land, the land of Canaan. 12 spies explored the land for 40 days. 2 said, Joshua and Caleb, if the Lord is with us, we got this, let's go. But 10 spies said, you know what, the land is great, but so are the people. Their towns are heavily fortified. We look like grasshoppers compared to them. We can't go. If we go, we'll die. They'll make our children slaves. Let's just go back to Egypt. Numbers 13:28. But the people living there are powerful, and their towns are large and fortified. We even saw giants there, the descendants of Anak. And they started to plot. They said, let's pick a new leader and go back to Egypt. Do you know what happened to all those who rebelled? All those who were not willing to fight? God said not a single one of them would enter the promised land. Numbers 14:23, they will never even see the land I swore to give their ancestors. None of those who have treated me with contempt will ever see it. This is the land that God promised to the Israelites. And God said, I'm not going to let you fight alone. God was going to be with them. God was going to give them this land. But the moment they said, we can't, God said, you are treating me with contempt. And all those who rebelled, they died in the desert. And all of Israel suffered as a result of it. They wandered the desert for 40 years before the Israelites got to enter the promised land. Numbers 14:31, you said your children would be carried off as plunder. Well, I will bring them safely into the land, and they will enjoy what you have despised. For 40 years, they wandered. That wasn't the original plan. The original plan was for them to obey God and enter the promised land. But because they refused to fight, they wandered for 40 years. And after that 40 years, did the children, did they avoid fighting? No. They still had to fight their way into the promised land. They still had to fight descendants of giants, and generations later, David still had to face a giant. Giants just don't go away. Battles in your life, they don't just disappear. When God needs something to be done, He needs it to be done. And yeah, it's really hard to be the first one to fight against a giant. It's really hard to be the first one in your family to do something that no one has ever done. It's really hard to accomplish something in this church when it hasn't been done before. But if you refuse, you will wander, and those around you will wander. And sooner or later, someone down the line will still have to fight that battle. And before you think it's wonderful, oh, I don't have to fight, someone else can fight. If you don't fight your battles, the giants that are before you, you won't get to see God's purpose fulfilled in your life. And not only will you wander, but those around you will wander as well. Numbers 14:33, and your children will be like shepherds wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. In this way, they will pay for your faithlessness until the last of you lies dead in the wilderness. I'll ask our praise team to come up, please. The children of the spies, they wandered 40 years before they got to enter the promised land. That's what can happen when you run from fights that you're supposed to fight. Parents, I know it's tough, but listen, if you don't fight the giants before you, it could delay promises not only for you, but for your children. Leaders, listen please. All of you who hold church titles, teachers, praise team, youth leaders, young adult leaders. If you refuse to fight giants in this church, it won't just affect you. It will affect your followers. If you refuse, you'll wander and your followers will wander, possibly for years to come. And I know some of you are thinking, well, I got no role in this church. I'm just a regular attendee. Well, do you want to see church just the same, over and over, stuck in the same place? Because David had no role in the army. He was a teenager, but he still stepped up. Imagine what would have happened that day if David refused to fight. They would have been enslaved by the Philistines for God knows how long. Yeah, it's really hard to be the first one. It's really hard to step up. Lord knows some of the giants some of you are facing, the storms that you are in. We don't get to choose them. We can't change the fight. You can choose to stay and fight. When 10 spies said that we cannot fight, Joshua and Caleb said, we can. Here's the thing, they didn't deny what the 10 said. They didn't deny that the people there were powerful and strong. They didn't deny that there were fortified towns. They didn't deny there were descendants of giants there. But their conclusion was different. One group said, we can't win because we're like grasshoppers. The other group said, we can win because God is with us. Two different groups, they saw the same thing, drew the different conclusions, and based on their conclusions, they were willing to take different actions. One said, we can't, we'll lose. One said, we can. I don't know if you guys know who Cus D'Amato is, but Cus, he's a famous boxing trainer who trained elite boxers like Mike Tyson. And during an interview, he said this quote, "A coward and a hero, they are the same. They feel the same. It's what they do that makes them different." In other words, the hero feels just as frightened as the coward. But it's what he does that makes him different. It's what he does that makes him a hero. And the other, it's what he doesn't do that makes him a coward. It's very simple. I love that quote. Saul and David both saw the same giant, a different conclusion. One said, "You can't fight him, you're just a boy." Refused to take any action, paralyzed in fear. But David said, "Do not worry, because the Lord will rescue me from this Philistine." Listen, courage does not mean that your fears and your worries and anxieties are gone. Courage does not mean that the storms disappear and the giants just automatically fall. But courage is knowing that God is in control and that He is bigger and mightier than any problem, any giant that you will ever face. And it's you deciding in faith that you will trust God over your fears. You're either going to live in fear of what might happen, paralyzed like the Israelites, shaken, stuck in the same place, or you're going to be like David and step up despite your fears, despite your anxiety, despite your worries. Because trust me, the devil does not want you to take any action. He wants you to cower in fear, retreat, be stuck in the same problem over and over again. But the greatest moments of growth, they happen when we take on fights that we didn't expect. If it wasn't for Goliath, David would have never been tested for all to see and become a leader. And you know, it's amazing that in Saul's kingdom, when Saul was king, no one was willing to fight a giant. Nobody. But when David was king, David's men would also go on slaying giants. Saul's kingdom doesn't mention mighty warriors, but David's kingdom mentions mighty warriors, some who fought hundreds in a single battle and won. How amazing. It takes one giant slayer. It takes one person of faith to set an example and break barriers that have never been broken before. This giant that you're facing today, it will not be the last one. The giant you faced last, it will not be the last one. There will be more battles to come. But if you look at the heroes of the Old Testament, those who were willing to stand and put their faith in God, they were the ones that were remembered as heroes. They are the ones that got to experience and witness God's promises. If you want to win against giants, it's pretty clear. Don't lean on yourself, you lean on God for strength. You put faith in Him that He is bigger and mightier than any storm, any giant that you will ever face. And when you learn to trust Him, not only will it change your life, it will change those around you for generations. We need to be that church. I want to ask all of you to stand, because before we praise, I want us to pray as one group. invite you to close your eyes and use your voices to pray. Some of you are facing giants right now. Some of you are running from battles right now. Stop comparing yourself to the giant, but lean on God and realize that God is mightier than your giants. He's bigger than your storm. Would you lean on Him for help to fight the battles and have victory? Aren't you tired of being stuck in the same place? Don't you want to break some generational curses? Don't you want to make an impact in this church and your followers, your children, those around you? Let's be a church that relies on God for strength and courage and overcomes and have victories. Would you pray over your giants right now? Would you trust in God?